San Francisco fog swallows the rock whole. It's freezing. Inside the hole, the most dangerous man in America sits in absolute silence. Look closely at his hands. These hands have choked rivals. They've held shotguns. They've built an empire on blood. But tonight, they aren't gripping a switchblade. They're gripping a pen. Scratch, 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 scratch. The Godfather of Harlem isn't plotting a hit. He's writing a poem, and it's the only confession he'll ever make. The ferry ride across the bay doesn't feel like a transport. It feels like a funeral procession. The water is choppy, gray, and colder than the grave. Ahead, the island rises out of the mist like a jagged tooth. They call it the Rock. But to the men in chains on the deck, it's just the end. There is no coming back from here. You don't serve time at Alcatraz. Alcatraz serves you. It eats you, digests you, and spits out a shell. When Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson steps onto the dock, the air changes. The wind off the Pacific cuts through the standard issue gray wool, but he doesn't shiver. He doesn't look down. He looks up. He takes the measure of the walls, the towers, the guards with their rifles trained on his chest. Most men shrink when they see the fortress. They fold inward, crushed by the sheer weight of the concrete. Bumpy Johnson stands taller. Inside, the processing is a ritual of humiliation. Clothes off, spread them, cough. The guards handle him with a specific kind of roughness, the kind born of fear. They know who he is. They know the file. This isn't a petty thief or a bank robber who got lucky once. This is the man who ran Harlem. This is the man who stared down the Italian mob and didn't blink. They strip him of his suits, his silk, his cash. They hand him the rough denim, the number. They try to strip away the Godfather to find the convict underneath. But they find out quickly that the suit didn't make the man. The man made the suit. Then comes the walk. Broadway, the main corridor of the cell house. This is where the reputation is weighed. In any other prison, fresh meat is tested. Catcalls, threats, noise. But when Bumpy walks down the line, the tier goes quiet. It's a heavy, suffocating silence. The other inmates, killers, kidnappers, the most violent men in America, they come to the bars. They watch. They don't scream. They study him. They see something different in his walk. He moves with a predatory grace, a slow, calculated rhythm that belongs in a boardroom or a back alley lounge, not a federal penitentiary. He doesn't walk like a prisoner. He walks like a landlord inspecting a crumbling building. He walks like he owns the concrete beneath his feet. Alcatraz was built to break men like Al Capone. It was designed to turn Machine Gun Kelly into a whimpering mess. It's a psychological pressure cooker, built on silence and isolation. The rule of silence might have been officially lifted, but the shadow of it remains. The walls act as a dampener. Hope doesn't travel well here. The guards are waiting for Bumpy to crack. They are waiting for the isolation to get to him, for the lack of respect to shatter his ego. They expect rage. They expect violence. They expect him to fight the system with his fists so they can throw him in the hole, known as D-block, and leave him there until his mind turns to mush. But they miscalculated. They looked at the rap sheet, but they didn't look at the man. Bumpy Johnson isn't just muscle. He is discipline. While other prisoners are fueled by impulse, Bumpy is fueled by strategy. He knows exactly why he is here. He was too big for a regular cage. The system couldn't control him, couldn't buy him, and couldn't kill him without starting a war in New York. So they exiled him. They put him on a rock in the middle of the ocean and hoped the salt air would erode him. The cell door slides shut. The sound of steel on steel echoes like a gunshot. Asterisk, clang, asterisk. It's the sound of finality. A 5 by 9 foot box, a toilet, a cot, a small table. This is his world now. No lieutenants, no runners, no bodyguards. Just four walls and a window looking out at a city he can't touch. San Francisco glitters in the distance, a cruel reminder of life. Most men look at those lights and weep. Bumpy Johnson sits on the edge of his cot. He smooths the wrinkles in his prison uniform. He laces his hands together. He takes a breath, tasting the damp mold and the metallic tang of the bay. He doesn't rage. He doesn't scream. He waits. The guards think they've locked a tiger in a cage. They don't realize they've just given a chess grandmaster a quiet room to think. The rock was supposed to be his end. He decided it would be his study. Alcatraz was a factory. Its product was broken men. The machinery of the prison, the routine, the counts, the isolation, was designed to grind you down until there was nothing left but a number. Most inmates fought back with physical things. They stole metal from the workshops to fashion shivs. They hoarded razor blades. They turned toothbrushes into daggers. In the yard, eyes were always scanning for a weapon, for an edge. Violence was the currency. It was the only language spoken in the cell block. If you weren't predator, you were prey. That was the law of the jungle, imported straight from the streets to the rock. But in the middle of this industrial-grade brutality, Bumpy Johnson was forging something else. He wasn't huddled in the corner grinding metal against stone. He sat at his small, bolted-down table. His posture was rigid. His focus was absolute. If you looked through the bars, you might think he was studying a map, plotting an escape, or calculating the odds of a gambling debt. You'd be wrong. He was counting syllables. He was measuring rhythm. The most feared gangster in Harlem, the man whose name stopped conversations, was writing poetry. It seems impossible. A contradiction in terms. Gangsters don't write poems. They don't deal in metaphors. They deal in lead. But history is full of men who found their minds only after they lost their freedom. In the American prison system, there is a unique archetype, the convict intellectual, the man who enters as a criminal and evolves into a thinker. The solitude of the cell does something to the human brain. It strips away the distractions. There are no nightclubs, no hustle, no constant looking over your shoulder. There is only time. Terrifying, empty time. For many, that time is a curse. It drives them mad. They scream. They hallucinate. For Bumpy, time was a resource. He treated his incarceration not as a punishment, but as a sabbatical. He turned his cell into a study. While the guys in D Block were screaming their lungs out, Bumpy was wrestling with language. He was looking for the right word to describe the gray of the fog, the ache of distance, the peculiar weight of regret. This act of creation was his rebellion. The system wanted him to be a thug. They wanted him to be a simple, violent animal that they could cage and point at. By writing, by creating art, he was refusing that label. He was reclaiming his humanity. You can lock up a body, but you can't handcuff an idea. And make no mistake, this wasn't a soft hobby. Bumpy attacked poetry with the same aggression he used in a turf war. He demanded excellence from himself. If a line didn't work, he cut it, mercilessly. He disciplined his thoughts, the way he disciplined his soldiers. The guards walking the tier didn't understand it. They saw a black man with a pencil and assumed he was doodling. They underestimated the weapon he was building. A shiv can only hurt one person at a time. It's a crude tool for a crude job. But words can travel. Words can leap over walls and swim across the bay. Words can change the narrative. Bumpy knew that his legacy was at risk. If he died in there, he was just another statistic, another dead gangster. But if he wrote, if he could capture his soul on paper, then he lived forever. He wrote about the Harlem he built and the Harlem he destroyed. He wrote about the women he loved and the men he buried. He poured the complexity of his existence onto the page. It was a vulnerability he could never show on the street. On the corner of 125th Street, he had to be stone. Here, in the dark, he could be flesh and blood. The poem became his confessional, his therapist, and his best friend. The other inmates had their shivs wrapped in rags, hidden in their mattresses, waiting for a moment of violence. Bumpy had his notebook, open on the table, waiting for a moment of truth. The envelope was standard-issue government stationery, thin, brown, cheap paper that tore if you looked at it too hard. Inside, the handwriting was meticulous. No crossed-out lines, no ink blots, just perfect cursive, flowing across the page like a river. Bumpy folded the paper once, twice, and slid it inside. He licked the seal. That taste, the bitter chemical taste of prison glue, was the only thing connecting him to the outside world. Getting a letter out of Alcatraz was harder than breaking a man out of a bank vault. Every word was scrutinized. The mailroom officers were the gatekeepers. They read everything. Love letters, legal appeals, grocery lists. They were looking for codes, for escape plans, for threats. When the officer picked up Bumpy's letter, he probably expected a message to a lieutenant, maybe an order to hit a snitch or a location for a stash of cash. He didn't find that. He found stanzas. He found rhythm. He found a piece of a human soul trapped in ink. The officer stamped it. Asterisk censored. Asterisk. Asterisk. Approved. Asterisk. The letter left the island on the evening boat. It crossed the bay, rode the rails, and traveled 3,000 miles east. It wasn't headed to a mob front in Harlem. It wasn't going to a lawyer's office in downtown Manhattan. The destination scrawled on the front was Times the Crisis asterisk. To understand the weight of that address, you have to understand the America of the mid-20th century. Asterisk. The Crisis Times wasn't just a magazine. It was the Bible of the civil rights movement, founded by W.E.B. Du Bois. It was the intellectual high ground of Black America. It was the publication that fought lynching, that argued for voting rights, that published the soaring prose of Langston Hughes and the sharp essays of the intelligentsia. It was a place for scholars, for activists, for the talented 10th. It was not a place for gangsters. Sending a submission to Times, the Crisis Times, was an act of supreme arrogance. It was Bumpy Johnson, looking the black establishment in the eye and saying, "I am one of you." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was demanding recognition. He was betting that his mind was just as sharp, just as valuable as the university-educated men who ran the movement. It was a gamble. If they rejected him, it would confirm what the warden said, that he was just an animal with a number. But if they accepted him, it changed everything. Imagine the scene in the editorial office in New York. The editor sorts through the stack. Essays on segregation, reports on legal battles in the South, and then an envelope with a federal prison return address. Asterisk Ellsworth Johnson, number AZ, 521. Asterisk. The name might have rung a bell. The Godfather of Harlem. The man the newspapers called a public enemy. The editor had two choices. He could throw it in the trash. That was the safe play. Why give a platform to a man who poisoned the very community they were trying to uplift? Why let a criminal speak on the same pages as saints? That would be the logical decision. Clear-cut, open and shut. But the editor didn't throw it away. He opened it. He read the lines. He saw the contradiction that defined Bumpy Johnson. The FBI file said, sociopath. The poem said, human. The file said, danger. The poem said, pain. It was a collision of two realities. On one side, the brutal facts of his crimes. On the other, the undeniable truth of his art. The editor made a decision that would ripple through the underground. He didn't look at the rap sheet. He looked at the work. He decided that the voice from the cell mattered. He decided that talent didn't stop at the prison gate. He accepted the submission. In that moment, the walls of Alcatraz cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough to let the light in. Bumpy Johnson, the man the government tried to bury under tons of concrete and steel, had just pulled off his greatest hustle. He didn't smuggle drugs. He didn't smuggle money. He smuggled himself. He broke out of the most secure prison in the world, not with a spoon or a raft, but with a poem. And when that issue of Times the Crisis Times hit the stands, sitting on newsstands from Harlem to Chicago, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a prisoner. He was a published author, and the world had to deal with it. The page was printed on cheap stock, sandwiched between articles on voting rights and social justice. The title was stark: The Prisoner. But in those two words, Bumpy Johnson stripped himself naked. You read it, and you expect rage. You expect a manifesto against the law, a justification of the hustle, or the angry rantings of a caged lion. You don't get that. What you get is something far more disturbing for a man of his reputation. You get sorrow. Deep, aching, articulate sorrow. The poem doesn't read like the work of a mob boss. It reads like the confession of a ghost. Bumpy writes about the silence. He writes about the dull, gray monotony that eats a man alive. He describes the heavy, suffocating weight of time, where days bleed into nights and the only thing that changes is the tide of the bay outside. This isn't the kingpin speaking. This isn't the man who ordered hits with a nod of his head. This is the man underneath the Italian suit. On the streets of Harlem, vulnerability gets you killed. It's a weakness, a crack in the armor where a knife can enter. Bumpy spent his entire life building a fortress around his emotions, wearing a mask of absolute, terrifying control. But here, on the page, the mask falls off. He talks about love, not as a conquest, but as a distant memory that hurts to touch. He talks about freedom, not as a physical state, but as a state of mind he lost long ago. And this creates a problem for the reader. It creates cognitive dissonance. We want our villains to be one-dimensional. We want them to be monsters, so we can feel good about locking them up. But The Prisoner forces you to look at Bumpy Johnson and see a human being. It forces you to ask the uncomfortable question: can a man who deals in death understand the fragility of life better than the rest of us? Is it a con? Is this just another hustle? A calculated move to gain sympathy from the parole board? You look for the lie. You look for the manipulation. But poetry is a dangerous place to lie. You can fake a smile. You can fake an alibi. You can even fake remorse in a courtroom. But you cannot fake the specific, crushing loneliness that drips off these lines. This was the real Bumpy Johnson, the one who realized that his empire of numbers and protection rackets had bought him everything except the one thing that mattered: peace. The poem revealed that the poet and the killer weren't two different people. They were the same man, constantly at war with himself. The killer protected the poet, kept him safe from the brutality of the world. And the poet? The poet was the only one who could mourn for what the killer had to do. News travels fast in Harlem. It moves faster than the A train, slipping through the cracks of the pavement and riding the smoke in the jazz clubs. But the real news, the stuff that matters, always lands in the barber shop first. On a Saturday morning, the shop on 135th Street is the center of the universe. The air is thick with the smell of talc, bay rum, and tobacco. Men are arguing about Joe Louis, about the numbers racket, about the police. It's loud. It's chaotic. It's the heartbeat of the neighborhood. Then, someone walks in and throws a magazine on the waiting chair. It's not a racing form. It's not a tabloid with a picture of a starlet. It's Times the Crisis asterisk. "Turn to the back," the man says. The shop goes quiet. The buzzing of the clippers seems to fade. A customer picks it up, flips the pages, and stops. He reads the name aloud. Asterisk Ellsworth Johnson. Asterisk. For a second, nobody speaks. They know that name. They know it from the whispers on the corner. They know it from the bodies that turned up in the river. They know Bumpy Johnson as the man who carries a switchblade and a shotgun. They know him as the man you don't look in the eye unless you want to disappear. But here, in black and white, sitting next to essays by doctors and lawyers, is his poetry. It doesn't make sense. It's a glitch in the matrix. "The prisoner?" one man asks. "Bumpy wrote this?" They read the lines. They expect it to be rough. They expect it to be angry. Instead, they find something elegant. They find a mind that is sharp, observant, and deeply educated. This was the moment the perception shifted. Before this, Bumpy was a boss. He was a warlord. But after the poem hit the streets, he became something else. He became the Professor. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a title of nobility in the underworld. In the streets, muscle is cheap. Any fool can pull a trigger. Any idiot can swing a bat. But a man who can think? A man who can navigate the complex, highbrow world of the NAACP while running the shadow economy of Harlem? That is a man to be feared in a completely different way. The publication of The Prisoner sent a shockwave through the city's nervous system. Uptown, the intelligentsia didn't know what to do. They were praising a piece of art created by a man they publicly despised. They had to reconcile the fact that the most articulate voice on suffering came from a cell in Alcatraz, written by a career criminal. It made him complex. It made him human. And that made him dangerous to their worldview. Downtown, the reaction was even more interesting. The Italian families, the syndicates, they monitored everything. They saw the magazine. They had their translators read it. They looked for the code. They thought, asterisk. Surely, this is a message. The stanzas must correspond to coordinates. The rhymes must be instructions for a hit. Asterisk. They didn't get it. They couldn't understand that a gangster could simply be an artist. They viewed it as a trick, a strategy they weren't smart enough to decipher. And that confusion bred caution. You don't attack a man who is playing a game you don't understand. By publishing a poem, Bumpy Johnson didn't just express his feelings. He intimidated his rivals with his intellect. He showed them that while they were playing checkers with guns, he was playing chess with ideas. The poem didn't get him out of prison. It didn't cut his sentence short. But it did something more important. It kept his name alive in the barbershops. It turned him from a memory into a legend. When people spoke of Bumpy now, they didn't just talk about his violence. They talked about his mind. He wasn't just the guy who could break you. He was the guy who could outthink you. And in the world of organized crime, the reputation of being a genius is better than a loaded gun. The professor was born in that cell, but he was crowned in the barbershop. When the heavy steel doors of Alcatraz finally swung open, Bumpy Johnson stepped out into the blinding white fog of the San Francisco Bay. He was leaving behind the damp walls, the endless counts, and the suffocating silence of the hole. He was a free man. But as he boarded the ferry back to the mainland, he wasn't just leaving a prison. He was leaving behind the only place where he had been allowed to be vulnerable. The return to Harlem was not a quiet affair. It was a coronation. The streets buzzed with the news. The king was home. He slid back into the rhythm of the neighborhood as if he had never left. The leather booth at the back of the club was waiting. The runners were waiting. The money was waiting. And Bumpy Johnson, the professor, picked up the crown and put it back on his head. He went back to work. He organized the numbers. He settled disputes with a razor sharpness that left rivals bleeding in the gutter. He navigated the treacherous waters between the Italian mob and the black community with the cold, calculated precision of a grandmaster. To the outside observer, nothing had changed. He was still the hard-bitten gangster, the man who walked through the valley of the shadow of death and feared no evil because he was the evil. But the poem remained, that piece of paper, archived in the stacks of times. The crisis asterisk stood as a haunting piece of evidence. It was proof that inside the chest of the mad dog of Harlem beat the heart of a writer. And this creates a tragedy far deeper than any gunshot wound. It suggests that Bumpy Johnson wasn't born a monster. He was crafted into one. This is the dark side of the American dream, the side they don't put on billboards. We are told that talent is the ultimate ticket out of poverty. We are told that if you are smart enough, if you are articulate enough, you can transcend your circumstances. Bumpy Johnson had the mind of a scholar. He had the soul of a poet. He had the discipline of a monk. By all accounts, he should have been a senator, a CEO, or a literary giant. But he was a black man in mid-century America, born into a world where those doors were welded shut. The poet didn't stand a chance against the gangster because the poet couldn't pay the rent. The poet couldn't protect the neighborhood from the predatory incursions of the five families. The poet couldn't command respect in a world built on violence. So, Bumpy made a choice. He suffocated the artist to save the man. He treated his poetry like a secret lover, something to be visited in the dark moments of the soul, but never acknowledged in the daylight. He walked the streets with a scowl, projecting power, projecting invincibility, while knowing that a part of him, the best part of him, was slowly dying of starvation. The tragedy of Bumpy Johnson isn't that he went to prison. The tragedy is that prison was the only place where he felt free enough to speak his truth. When he returned to Harlem, he returned to the performance. He put the mask back on. The professor became a cruel irony, a nickname that honored his intellect while mocking the wasted potential of it. He lived the rest of his life as a king. He died a legend. But if you look closely at the history, if you read the words he left behind in that magazine, you see the ghost of the man who never got to exist. You see a life that was hijacked by necessity. He conquered the streets, yes. He won the war for Harlem, but in doing so, he lost the peace he had found in a jail cell. The gun won, the pen lost, and that is the saddest story of all. History remembers the muzzle flash. It remembers the bodies dropping in the Harlem River. It remembers the mad dog who terrified a city. But if that's all you know about Bumpy Johnson, you're missing the point. You're looking at the scar and missing the surgery. The real lesson of Ellsworth Johnson isn't about how to run a numbers racket or how to intimidate a rival. It's about the one thing they couldn't take away from him. They took his freedom. They took his money. They took his prime years. But they couldn't take his mind. A switchblade dulls. A shotgun runs out of shells. Muscle fades. But intellect? Intellect is the only weapon that gets sharper the more you use it. Bumpy Johnson survived Alcatraz not because he was the toughest guy in the yard, but because he was the smartest guy in the room. He understood that in a world built on brute force, the man who controls the language controls the narrative. He didn't just outfight his enemies. He outthought them. So, here is the question I want you to answer in the comments below. Be honest. If Bumpy Johnson had been born in a different zip code, with a different skin color, do you think we would be calling him a gangster? Or would we be studying him in business school as a CEO who built an empire from nothing? Was he a criminal by nature or a genius by necessity? Let me know what you think. I read every single comment. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of Harlem, do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps the algorithm more than you know. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what we've got cooking for next week. We're going from Harlem to Little Italy, walking straight into the office of the only man Bumpy respected, Lucky Luciano. Until then, remember this. In this life, you either write the story or you become the headline. Stay dangerous.